I'm next, and I have a few comments to say that I think will pick up on some of what Stephen has presented in terms of the security dimension, which is really how I'm coming at thinking about this agreement. There are lots of things to discuss, but I'm going to hone in on a couple of them. And just to begin by saying I was struck by the agreement when it was set out that some of the language that's used is around more Canada-US friendship, sharing, collaboration. This is the kind of rhetoric that's presented. And to shamelessly promote myself, I have a piece in rabble.ca this morning that came out that I say, you know, these are great values. Let's all be in support of friendship, sharing, collaboration. You know, we learn them in kindergarten, we practice them well, that's great. But that's not what this agreement is about. And in fact, we have to move beyond a kindergarten relationship to start thinking about questions to do with civil rights, due process, and accountability. And so that's the kind of thing that I want to talk about today. And I'm particularly concerned about the ways that security is being built into this agreement. And I'm just going to talk about some of the pilot projects that have been underway that are being expanded under the new Canada-US agreement. On land, we have already the integrated border enforcement teams called IBETs and the Border Enforcement Security Task Force, just known as BESTs. It's a nice little acronym there. And these are both already in place at land borders between Canada and the United States. And they have a mandate to stop and deter criminal activities, such as drugs and weapons smuggling, as well as human trafficking. But they are cross-border initiatives that bring in online Canada and US information sharing, as well as intelligence sharing across the border. So the BEST, for example, draw together local, regional, and national organizations. So this includes Toronto Metropolitan Police, which is identified on the Homeland Security website, working with US Customs and Immigration. So that's the kind of information sharing that's happening on that level through the BESTs. The IBETs draw together the RCMP, Canada Border Services Agency, US Customs and Border Protection, US Bureau of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the US Coast Guard. And there are 15 regions designated across Canada with 24 sites where that kind of interoperability is happening between the security agencies already in place. What will happen under the new border agreement is an expansion of those kinds of projects. And what they've touted, and there's very little detail, but in what they've proposed, we can see even with a next generation initiative that they've put on the table that this will be expanded. So it won't just be at the border crossing sites, but the actual places between borders. So that's one thing, it's expanding across of it in terms of its territorial reach. But it's also going to facilitate cross-border intelligence and information sharing. But what we have with this, with the next generation that they've already identified, is bringing on board the RCMP, but with Public Safety Canada, the Department of Justice Canada, and the US Department of Justice, as well as the US Department of Homeland Security. So we're not just talking about information sharing amongst border agencies. These are the national security agencies that are now being brought in to these projects on the ground. So I think this is taking this in a very different dimension, where questions to do with criminal justice that were the purview of border security previously are now designated as national security issues. So I think that's something we have to ask lots of questions about, particularly as Homeland Security has a much more kind of overreaching way of dealing with information and privacy and things like detention as well. So big questions are raised by that. Another initiative that's being rolled out more expansively under this agreement is the Shiprider program. And the Shiprider, which was signed into place in 2009 between our former Public Safety Minister, Peter Van Loan, and Janet Napolitano, who's the US Secretary of Homeland Security, allows vessels on shared waterways. So this could be Pacific, East Coast, Great Lakes, for example. Those vessels on shared waterways to be jointly patrolled, or jointly manned by the US Coast Guard, as well as Canadian Border Services agents. So this means that the border is no longer a border on the water. You can follow someone across the border and still claim jurisdiction when you cross over. So you could be a US Coast Guard, you're pursuing a boat, it crosses over onto Canadian waterways, and you can actually arrest and detain that person on the Canadian side. This is already being made part of our Canada-US agreement, but it's going to be expanded and renewed under the new agreement. And in fact, Canada has legislation that is not being passed yet, but it's called Bill 60, Keeping Canadians Safe, Protecting Borders Act, that will allow these designated officers the equivalent of RCMP jurisdiction anywhere in Canada. So they might start by pursuing somebody on water, They might not catch them, they go onto land, and US agents can now have the equivalent of RCMP jurisdiction anywhere in Canada. And the Next Generation initiative that I just mentioned is not only expanding in terms of information sharing, but they're going to have that same kind of jurisdiction as well. So we have to be worried about what's being rolled out under that purview as well. And so big questions are raised about these initiatives. Where and when does cross-border initiatives start and end? Who decides? Who has jurisdiction over the information? Who is responsible and accountable, especially if something goes wrong in any of these events? And how might national security concerns in these instances be used to sidestep other kinds of legal formalities that we have in place around proper criminal entrapment and so on, things like that? So there are lots of questions that are raised by these kinds of security agreements that are being put forward, and really deeper security interoperability. And another concern that I have is that model of security interoperability is really building on military interoperability. And we have a much broader military agreement that's being pushed forward under this new agreement as well. So the Civil Assistance Plan, for example, has been a preamble to the current border agreement. And this plan that was announced in 2008 between Canada Command and US Northern Command allows the military of one nation to cross over into the other in case of an emergency. It could be a natural emergency or it could be a terrorist attack. But we have authorized US military to cross over into Canada and at our request, but to operate on our soil. Cooperation is not in and of itself a bad thing, so these things might have some good points to them. But what happens with the Civil Assistance Plan is, on the one hand, they have this greater agreement between Canada and the US in terms of military operations, but they're trying to also align those military operations across the two countries. So there's a greater rapprochement in that sense. But there's also, in pushing that, I think, moving it into these different dimensions, making a greater case for legitimizing the militaries operating on domestic soil point blank. And Defense Minister Peter MacKay last week announced that the Civil Assistance Plan will be extended for another 2 years. And he also announced in this meeting last week at the same time a new combined defense plan between Canada and the US. And he said, and these are his words, "This agreement provides a framework for the combined defense of Canada and the US during peace, contingencies, and war." So this is military interoperability across the board at all times in all places. And as he went on to say, "The historic strength of our bilateral military-to-military relationship is a testimony to the level of exceptional partnership that can be developed between Canada and the US. And this successful relationship should serve as a template for a broader discussion with our civilian colleagues." And so what he's indicating there is this military interoperability is actually the template for the security interoperability that's happening at the border. So what I'm trying to flag is this concern for deeper securitization and militarization that's happening through this Canada-US agreement that ties into a deeper militarization that we see happening in Canada anyway. And Stephen referred to the G20 with the military, or we can talk about the Olympics, or the increasing use of military when it comes to Indigenous land claims and protests thereof, or in Canada's north as well. So we have now a permanent kind of going up in the summer. If Harper goes to visit, Operation Nanook is in place in the Canadian north. There's also this militarization we see at citizenship ceremonies. So we have military personnel on stage alongside our presiding judges, which is a new phenomenon in the last couple of years. And in the new citizenship guide, a promotion actually for the military to newcomers who are the target audience of that guide. And I'll just give you a line here. You can serve in your local part-time Navy, militia, and air reserves and gain valuable experience, skills, and contacts. Young people can learn discipline, responsibility, and skills by getting involved in the cadets. And so this is actually with great URL links so that you can actually go to the websites for the Navy, Army, and Air Force directly from the citizenship guide, promotion of this kind of more militarized citizenship in Canada. And for many in the audience here, it will be also important to note that in December of last year, so just a few weeks ago, a Senate review on national security and defense actually wanted to bring back the Canadian Officers Training Corps on university campuses. This was in place in the first part of the 20th century, where we had officers training as part of Canadian campuses, where you would train undergraduates, as they call them, in leadership skills and community service. as they prepare for a career in the forces while doing their undergraduate education. Now, it might seem to be getting off topic with that kind of discussion of militarization, but I think it's really pertinent to understanding what the framework is for understanding the Canada-US agreement, because I think what's actually happening there is an opportunity that's being seized to roll out the securitization, the militarization, under the guise of economic need, right? We know clearly now with the Keystone that if the Canadian government doesn't want to work with the US or can't work with the US, it can go elsewhere. We can diversify. So, you know, the question is raised, why in Canada-US issues do we always seem to be playing this game that we roll over and play dead? So anyway, what I'm trying to present here is an idea that we're seeing more securitization, we're seeing more militarization. It's not just about friendship, sharing, and collaboration, but a new dynamic in Canada-US relations, but that's also speaking to a changing idea of Canada. And one of the reasons for wanting to put the panel together is start throwing out some of these questions to have more debate and discussion about these kinds of shifts that are taking place. So thank you.